you're all being recorded for posterity. So here we are, week 9. Who knew the fun would last this long? So what we're going to talk about tonight is usual stuff, except first, questions. I'm going to go over something really not from week 8, but week 7 on the homework. Our usual exciting PowerPoints, breakout groups, and more Q&A. First off, before we go any further, anyone have any questions about life, what it all means, what's going on, and why you care about anything? No? No one has anything? You're all concentrating on next Thursday and what to do.
I think we're all depressed because we're watching the sun go down and it's 3:06 p.m.
You saw the sun today? I'm so jealous. Although I did see 2 deer today. Had 2 bucks come by our property. This is kind of 2 at the same time, 1 on each side of the house.
You'll see me at this time of the day several times adjusting the blinds because it's in front of my desk and the sun just sets right in front of my window and I watch it. It just blinds me.
Well, those of us that have clouds feel no really sympathy for you at the moment, but I'd love to have that problem at the moment, but I don't. I have dull skies and it rained about an hour ago. So, but it's Oregon, you can't complain. Alrighty, so Q&A week 8 recap, which is really my part of that week 8 is from the previous week 7. And it's a problem we had out there on the homework. And I bring this up because 4 of you had the exact same response. And you had a problem from page 243. This is going back to chapter 11, where you had a 4-part problem of 20 points. So everyone was worth, each part of the problem was worth 5 points. And it came down to this where you had the number of haircuts, and most people did a great job on what's the average demand for haircuts. If the capacity is 35, what's the average utilization? If the capacity is 35, how much capacity cushion does it have? But then we got down to part D. Haircut costs if it's $50 per lost haircut, due to the customer's dissatisfaction, and $100 for so many units of capacity. And I have the actual set, just do the first 2 problems, 20 and 25. And how much capacity should be built in to minimize costs? And I wrote, yes, the book asked for all 5 capacities. I just asked the first 2. 2 of you actually, despite my writing that, did all 5. So kudos. But you did more work than I had to. But here's the rub. 4 of you said, I can't figure out how to do this, not even sure. And this is where I said, when you read the chapters, don't skip parts. If you go to page 237 to 238, you have this very good example of this problem being worked out in detail. All you had to do is plug and chug the number of haircuts in place of thousands of gallons and change out the probabilities. But don't skip those solved problems at the end of the chapter when you read the book, because it's right there. And I also bring it up because on tonight's question, or tonight's lecture, you have 3 solved problems, one of which goes through each type of calculation for inventory, an EOQ, a P and a Q, which you all know. So don't skip those ones because you had the exact answer you needed to follow on that part D. For those of you who just said, I'm not sure how to do it, I would say, make sure you don't stop before page 237, because the answer is right there and very clearly. So we say you all know that you're all reading the chapter ahead of time, because that's what the syllabus says, so you all do it, right?
Yeah, I think it's like I was one of the people that missed that.
I'm not asking anyone to do anything. But
no, I'm just saying, I think I had trouble just because, just the way the question was formulated. I wasn't quite sure what it was. I understand now what it was asking, but I just kind of got lost in the math there of how I would utilize a formula. Like I read it in the book. I just didn't get the math, or it just went over my head. But yeah, I think it's just the wording that questions what really threw most of us off, because it makes more sense now.
Because one of the things too, and that's why a lot of these questions, especially tonight, you're going to hear me talking about the philosophy behind some of the methodology we calculate, is that it's very plug and chug once you realize where you are. You're not having to calculate standard deviations from scratch and all these things. But if you can recognize where you are in the context of the question, it's very much a formula plug and chug type of stuff. And I'm not saying you don't need to know how to create these formulas from scratch. If this is operations management too, I'd probably make you do that. But it's a lot of understanding the context of where you are. And once you get that, you tend to just have all the pieces there to put it. And at risk of jumping ahead to the end of tonight's lecture, when you talk about what's going to be on the final, you'll have questions where you have all the pieces. Your job is to figure out, okay, given the pieces I have, which set of formulas, if you will, I do. Now, if you can calculate it and drive it from scratch, cool, you're better at Fourier series systems than I am. But it's all about the context. And that's why I tend to emphasize the context of what you're doing and what you're trying to do, because that's what tends to mess up people is you overthink it and you see too many numbers and think, okay, I'm not sure how we're going to come to it. But once you get the context of what you're being asked in the EOQ, that P or that Q format, don't worry about those letters yet, you've read them once. But that's what I'm going through is sort of, people tend to overthink themselves and trip themselves up. There's no questions I'm asking you on the final or on the homework. They're meant to be trick questions.
Sure. And I'm not saying it was intended to be a trick question.
No, I hear you.
Sure. It's just people like me who don't have calculus and so forth yet. Like I was reading the text for this week's chapter and I was like, yeah, it's a basic calculus principle. It's foreign to a lot of us. It's not that we aren't really trying to retain the formula. It's just kind of this getting lost in the forest type of thing.
What I say is, unless it's like after 9 p.m. on a Sunday, you read something like that, you got 2 sets of homeworks left, if essentially not counting discussions. Shoot me a question, say, hey, I don't get the context. You can ask me questions. I'm not going to give you the answers, but I will give you the context of how to find the answers. So feel free to shoot me and say, hey, what's this? And we can set up a separate Zoom. I've done that with a couple of people on some things. So just shoot me a question. All righty, any more on this? Now everyone's going to read 237 to 238. All righty. Hearing none and seeing no emojis go off. So I got to switch mine to grid so I can see as many faces as possible. There we go. Hold on. Forgive me taking care of my own stuff. There, now I can see all the names. Independent demand inventory. Oh, that sounds really, really intimidating. Basically, the overall for this is inventory. And when you say independent demand inventory, what the heck does that mean? I'm going to go through this, but basically it's where demand is just there and how inventory manipulates independent of demand. Doesn't have to, but it can. Oops. Hold on. All right. Definitions. Inventory, a stock of materials used to facilitate production or satisfy customer demands. Oh my goodness, that sounds really complicated. The thing when you think about inventory is it's all contextual. One man's inventory is another man's finished product. Par Lumber sells lots of board feet and 2x4s. That's their finished product. But a contractor gets that as a materials to make his finished product, which is a house or a building. So when you think about something like, is wood inventory, product, work in process, it's all contextual depending whatever thing you're in. Your inventory is someone else's finished product. And they talk about types of inventory, raw materials. Again, if you're a contractor, your raw materials might be the 2x4s that you have on a lumber drop. The work in progress might be that framed house, because as a contractor, you're going to sell a framed house. Your product isn't 2x4s. Your product is a final house you're going to sell. So the 2x4s that are partially assembled is your work in progress inventory. That might be several houses. They're in that WIP or WIP. You see a WIP all over the place. So when you see that, always think of something work in progress. Whatever you're making, it's a work in progress. For Par Lumber, their work in progress might be big trees that are going halfway through the mill to come out 2x4s and 2x6s. So think about that context. And finished goods, well, when Par is selling their 2x4s, that's their finished good. When the contractor finishes building a house and sells it to some nice, young, happy people, that's their finished goods. So think about the context always. So materials flow, and this is, again, contextual. Raw materials go into some sort of productive process, and that's when we talk about the work in progress, when you're turning what you do for your final sales from some raw material into something else, whether it be trees. Raw materials might be trees that you're milling into something to come out finished goods, 2x4s, or it might be 2x4s, concrete, subflooring that go into your work in progress to come out with a house. Whatever you're doing, it might be silicon and polymers that come into your productive process to make wafers at the other end. Whatever you're doing. And the finished good is in the context of whatever you do for a living. The finished good is what your customer finally gets. Par Lumber's customer might be a contractor or a building developer. Cool. So that's their customer, their finished goods. But those finished goods are someone else's raw materials. But work in progress, always remember that, because especially when you're dealing with accounting, it has in your business, and you have to worry about what you're going to report to the IRS and not report. Be able to identify what is work in progress, raw materials, and all these things come into play. Has anyone ever done, when I was a starving college student, gone to a department store and did their midnight inventories? We had to count up all their stuff and how much they have so you can put it on tickets and report it and calculate it to give it to the accountants.
Have you ever heard of the company RGIS?
RGIS, no. I believe you know.
So it stands for something retail-grocery inventory system. So they're like a multinational conglomerate.
Mm-hmm.
I worked for them for several months in Baltimore, and that was literally our entire job. We carried little like data software things, and we go and physically scan and do the inventory for the entire store. But that was their entire industry, was producing those reports for organizations.
I'm jealous because in my day, before we had the SQs all finalized, I went there and counted coats on the rack at Meyer and Frank, or what used to be Robinson's May, then Meyer and Frank, and put little yellow tickets on it. I remember getting criticized because I put loops in my twos, and the scanner wouldn't read loops in my twos. You had to do twos down straight over.
Some assignments for that job, there would be rudimentary things like that too, where we're just to physically count it. But yeah, really varied.
Be able to track this it's important. And this is why, I mean, a lot of software, I used when I was in construction, we use I think they still exist. I don't know if they still exist by themselves, but Timberline software, which used to be located out on Nimbus. And they had ways that you tracked it by job. Almost like a job batch process, because every house had an assigned lumber drop in that. And we were able to track which house was completed and for sale, and which one was a work in progress. And it got really complicated when you had a work in progress that had a pre-sale, but that's an accounting class. Ask me about that later. So they use this great analogy, which I like in the book. I'm sorry, on the analogy for inventory, where they have a bucket with demand going out at the bottom. How many people are getting your product? Supply coming at the front, and then you have this thing called inventory level. And what we're dealing with the next couple of chapters is, what is the right inventory level? Because we've already talked about in our example so far, there's a cost to having stuff just lying around before it sells. You got to store it. You have to have people to count it. You got to keep it optimally, fresh. If you're dealing with wine, which I have a good friend who's in the wine business, they hate this because when they have large inventories, they have to have air-conditioned, humidity-controlled warehouses, which are expensive as all get out. And so they don't like having lots of inventory. On the other hand, they have to, in order to get certain wines, they have to buy it in big lots or they get none. So the inventory level, as we'll talk about, is a question of both what your industry dynamics require, what management's decisions say we should have, and ultimately, because remember out there, there's that customer who wants what they want, when they want it, and if you can't do it because you can't get the inventory level and supply rate and demand rate to flow rightly, they may go somewhere else. Which I'll tell a personal story where I started going somewhere else last week because I couldn't get the 2x6s I wanted. So, purpose of inventories. Now, when we talk about these things, some of these terms are going to come up later in the discussion tonight. So it's important to think about what they are, because we're going to use these terms and put numbers on them to come up with the right level of inventory you should keep later. One of the key ones is safety stock. Protect against uncertainties, demand, supply, lead times, and schedule changes. So cool. One of the biggest examples we've talked about in the last, 8 weeks, this is week 9, is like personal protective equipment, where the safety stocks turned out not to be enough. And there's a funny story behind this, because I was talking with someone who works for a news station, Channel 12, who lives near our former chief of police. And at the end of, this is where it comes managerial decisions, what you think is going to happen. When this COVID thing started coming up, they started announcing that hospitals were in dire straits because they only had 2 weeks supply of personal protective equipment left. And I asked them, said, well, you know what? On average, a hospital, how many weeks supplied a hospital keeps on a personal protective equipment? I said about 2 weeks. They order twice a month. Now then, and I don't say this to say, and someone's going to say, oh no, I'm not a conspiracy theorist criticizing this, but the problem with that safety stock was not that they were not keeping adequate safety stock in the context, but they didn't predict a massive surge of demand. And so there was a management problem. Now we could argue what manager would have predicted that now in October, where we had just rumors of something in September of last year, something was going to happen, but was it a failure? Yes. But the crisis wasn't the fact that hospitals only had a couple of weeks of stock. They ordered twice a month, because if they had everything they needed, they had nowhere to store it physically on the floors. And they try to work in a just-in-time inventory, where they get just when they run out, the next one comes in the door. Problem was, no one predicted what was going on in the increased demand, and the fact that all of a sudden consumers that never had bought a mask in their life would suddenly be ordering them too. And then hoarding started and all that. So economic production and purchase, cycle inventory. One thing we looked at in that beer production example, that wonderful, beautiful aggregate model, what I went through with the different beer levels and how to hire out the right number of people and have level hiring forces. Well, part of their inventory was a cycle inventory. They built up their inventory because in the summer they sold lots of beer, less in the wintertime. And so that's why they kept inventory in that example. They had 2 different ways of getting it, with a variable workforce, one with overtime and not. I'm not going to redo that example, but that was an example of cycle inventory. They kept inventory because they needed it. We also talked about Peeps that same week. Great example. I mean, Ms. Parson loves Peeps. I hate them, but it's sort of, that's why they're, I can tell you right now, they're doing massive productions of inventories of Peeps right now as we speak, because they're going to need them in, what's it, 1, 2, 3, 4 months. Now then, cover anticipated changes in demand and supply. Anticipation inventory. This is where we failed on personal protective equipment over the last few months. No one expected there to be this massive surge in demand. So we did not do this. We had a safety stock policy in place, but our anticipated change in demand, just no one anticipated it. So that's where we ended up with shortages, because there was no inventory to meet it. And provider transit. Pipeline inventory is that stuff where, what you're sending out the door versus what's on the way in. You might have ordered lumber from the lumber yard. It's on its way as you're sending other stuff out the door. That also, they don't really get into it in this chapter, but that's also part of just-in-time inventory. And how do you cost it? Well, Ray and I have already given our personal experiences about how you have to count it, but you have to item cost. What's it cost for that item of inventory? And you have, again, these things are going to, these items, which are definitionally given you at the beginning of the chapter, become very important because everything's going to have a number assigned to it later. Ordering cost. When you order something, it takes time to set it up. We've already talked about in some examples we had last week about how one of our Gantt charts had an item where, okay, they had a setup time where it had a 1 hour before they could switch from one machine to another, which changed the amount of time it took to get to your endpoint for your throughput and make time. Transportation costs. Yes, if it costs you some amount of money to ship 2x4s from here to there, that's part of your inventory costing. We've already talked about carrying or holding costs. We had those on the beer. that they had inventory. It cost money to store stuff. And as we went through that nice aggregate model where we talked about the beer they had to store, we had I can't remember what the cost was, but they had a percentage cost on every bottle of beer. They had to, I think it was 12 cents per gallon or something like that for every beer they have to store. That's a carrying cost. You're hoping to hold it, not selling it. You're just carrying it, not doing anything with it. They also talk about obsolescence, deterioration, and shrinkage. I actually just saw a documentary on bourbon over the weekend on CBS News. And it sounds facetious, but they have a horrible problem because they store it in wooden caskets, which are not airtight and exposed to air. And they lose what they call in Europe, we used to call it on sherry and port, the angel share, where it just evaporates. And they have a cost where if they wait too long before they tap their barrel, they might have nothing but black sludge. If they would take it too soon, they have a horrible whiskey, and they have to figure out the right way in timing, which comes up, timing, to tap that whiskey or tap that sherry or tap that port, because they lose just through evaporation and shrinkage. On the other hand, if you have too many 2x4s in your warehouse and it rains a lot, or you have too much raw wood, timber, out past Sherwood, whoever takes what the 20 or 22 out to Spirit Mountain, if they wait too long to harvest their wood or mill their wood, they lose some because the wood just gets rotten. All those types of things come into place.
Like the perfect analogy. I was gonna say that Home Depot is just the perfect analogy if anyone's ever been there or works there for just inventory management. But like you were talking about building a house, it's like very similar with managing the inventory, but it was interesting you're talking about like culling the wood and so forth. If it gets wet outside, that was a huge problem. So like that's how I ended up starting there, was because they were hiring seasonal people to take control of the lumber to make sure that the inventory is managed correctly. Because you imagine just interior two by fours, if they get wet, then obviously they're going to bow, and there's an incredible amount of waste that's inherent in that. But just exact same thing we're talking about. It costs money to manage
that. And you say, but that's part of this. That actually bleeds into both the carrying costs and the ordering costs, because you got to set up how you're going to set up, put it there. You put it in a nice air-conditioned, humidity-controlled warehouse, like it's going to be fine wine. Okay, that might reduce your waste. On the other hand, how much waste can you afford? And this is part where we get into this is, well, is it more expensive to prevent any form of waste and to prevent any word? Or is it more expensive to say, okay, we're going to lose 5% automatically because of rot, but to prevent that 5% from doing it, it would cost us twice as much to store it. And those decisions that operations management has to make. Stock out cost is one of those ones which is a little tricky philosophically, because it's really the loss on what you're not going to be able to do, if you will. The example I gave from this last week was I had been battling evil ones, also known as squirrels and chipmunks, who like to dig under my foundation, and I had to redo my deck on the way into front house. And you know what? I went to Home Depot to get some 10-foot 2x6s. And you wouldn't believe they didn't have a single 10-foot 2x6 in the place. But out in Hillsborough, where they have Lowe's and Home Depot side by side, so I went to Lowe's. And they had a nice stack of 2x6s. So I got my 2x6s from Lowe's, and I had to go back and get some 2x4s, a couple more, but I haven't been back to Home Depot yet for lumber. By them failing to have the stock that their customer needed at the time, they actually have lost a customer until the day comes when I go to Lowe's and they don't have what I need and Home Depot has it. But for the time being, there's actually stock out costs for them. In one version, there's tons of stock out cost types. But again, the lost opportunity they have now by having their customer who demands everything, and then we look at everything, remember back to the early chapters, everything is back in our context of the consumer. This consumer wasn't happy. He stopped buying their stuff altogether. And I've been going to Lowe's for the last week and a half.
All I can add is that as a former employee in that exact organization, I'm intimately familiar with the politics of how inconvenient it is when you're out of stock and customers travel. it sucks, and they really need to figure a better way to address it.
And I'm not saying Home Depot is evil. I know there's going to be a time when I go to Lowe's and I get just as upset because they're out of my whatever it is. But for the time being that I stop going to Home Depot and I go to Lowe's, or the time that I stop going to Lowe's and go to Home Depot, that's a stock out cost that one of the others lost.
Especially, now put it on a perspective, if you're a contractor who's spending several $1,000s on raw materials, whether it's bulk tile or bulk lumber or what have you, either way, if you're missing a bundle of lumber or a pallet of tile, like it's huge loss in revenue.
Yeah, your production line, your production process has stopped because your supplier's failure.
And we even had a trouble with, so in Baltimore, we used to sell a specific 3/4 inch hardwood flooring that didn't have any kind of layer on top. And we kept getting production problems from the local distributor for the wood. So we just had to entirely discontinue selling unfinished hardwood, which is a big thing for contractors in the area. But I can only imagine how much analysis had to go into that decision, because that you're looking at, almost $3 a square foot. It's expensive material.
That's a type of stock out cost. Absolutely. Okay, inventory costs. Come on. Now this is where I'm going to put this. This goes actually, I left this little video. It's only a couple minutes, but it basically goes through all these types of things we talked about, how you cost your inventory. And hopefully everyone will hear the sound.
For deciding the best suitable inventory policy, the topmost criteria used is the cost function. This inventory analysis has 4 major components. Component number 1 is purchase cost. This is basically the nominal cost of an inventory. It is the cost incurred in buying from the outside sources, and it would be known as production cost if the items are produced within the organization. The cost is constant for a unit but may vary according to the quantity purchased increases or decreases. For example, the unit price is 20 rupees for up to 100 units and 19.50 rupees for more than 100 units. If a unit cost is constant, the control decisions would not have any effect, because whether all the requirements are produced just once or made in installments, the total amount of money involved would be the same. Component number 2 is ordering cost or setup cost. This occurs whenever the stock replenishes. It associates with the processing and chasing the purchased order, transportation, and inspection for quality. It is also called procurement cost. The parallel of ordering cost when the units are produced within the organization is the setup cost. It refers to cost incurred in relation to developing production schedules. The ordering cost and setup cost are taken to be independent to the order size. So the unit ordering, setup cost decreases as the purchase order increases. Component number 3 is carrying cost. Carrying cost is also known as holding cost, and it refers to the cost that is associated with storing an item in the inventory. It is proportional to the amount of inventory and the time taken to hold that inventory. The elements of carrying cost include opportunity cost, obsolescence cost, deterioration cost. The carrying cost is expressed in terms of rate per unit or as a percentage of the inventory value. And component number 4 is stockout cost. Stockout cost is the cost which incurs when customers are not being served. These costs imply shortages. If stockout is internal, that means that some production is lost internally, also resulting in idle time for man and machines. If stockout were external, it would result in potential sales or loss of customer goodwill. When the new shipment arrives, a customer who was denied earlier would be immediately supplied the goods. But it would involve costs like packaging costs and shipment costs.
Okay, so you've had about
For deciding the best
5 pages of this course in 2 minutes and 41 seconds. You're all experts now. So how do you calculate carrying costs, which we've talked about a lot? We've used carrying costs in context. You've been given numbers and storing beer for carrying costs. How do you calculate carrying costs? In 10 minutes or less.
Experts agree inventory carrying costs average between 20 to 30%, but inventory is money, And if you're not calculating holding costs accurately, you're tying up cash that could be better invested elsewhere. Over 65% of companies don't calculate their inventory carrying cost. Instead, they use rough estimates. So, how much does holding on to your inventory really cost? Inventory carrying cost consideration should include capital costs, inventory service expenses, storage space bills, and inventory risk. Once you've listed all the costs associated with inventory holding, add them up. Then divide the sum by the total value of your inventory. The answer is your company's inventory carrying cost percentage. Determining this will help you identify your true inventory investment, allowing you to set reduction goals to free up capital that could yield higher returns elsewhere.
Done. Whoa, don't want to stop. Go away. Yes, I'm going to close all tabs. Come on. There we go. Now then, a couple of things they put in there is that people tend to not calculate their carrying costs just as it says in the video. They use industry standards, and there are tons of industry standards that say, on average, it costs us this much to store stuff. And you may even get some regionally, but it can vary dramatically where you are in the country or in the world. This is where being able to calculate it on your own, just taking the time, most people just, oh, they say 35% on average, okay. But this is where you got to look at what you are in terms of a business industry, what your processes are, and are you a place where warehousing is really expensive? Are you a place where warehousing is really cheap? Are you a place where you have a steady flow of items that you can order all the time, that you can actually get enough inventory to store in the warehouse you buy? And people tend to really slough over this one. And when you consider how much money it is in some cases, or it might be much less, if you're automatically assuming these costs go into your inventory carrying costs and holding costs, you might be missing out on what you can do with that rest of that money that you're not spending because you're just assuming it's going into here. And most people don't notice it until they can't do something or they don't have enough of something. Because the cost of money is one of the things you have to take into account, along with the cost of everything else. Cost of money is the number one thing that I find people don't take into account. Money costs money. It does, in terms of interest rates, filing fees and that, and people forget the cost of money. Now then, we're going to take a quick segue. You're all experts on what it costs, what types of inventory and why to keep it, and why you need to care about what it costs. So now we're going to talk about demand. Why is demand? Well, because remember that spigot where you have stuff coming in, you have that magic water bucket of inventory and stuff going out. So we've talked about the stuff that's in that bucket, and we talked before about what goes into the bucket. Now we're talking about how fast the water of inventory flows out of that bucket. This is where we're going. So interdependent demand and dependent demand. Oh my goodness. Now, never had a lot of people in industry focus on these two terms, but they talk about the product, these types of terms. They're just saying, sitting down around a boardroom and saying, we have dependent demand, so we're going to do so-and-so. But they talk about the elements that go into these, and so you need to know where you are from a philosophical standpoint, because it depends on what your product is, whatever you're selling, whether it be a product or service, to understand the elements that go to create the type of demand. Even if you never use the term independent demand versus dependent demand, it's important you know the characteristics of whatever you're selling in this context. So, independent demand, finished goods, spare parts, independent of other items. Cool, and it requires forecasting. Well, I would say all these things require forecasting, just different type of forecasting. Dependent demand, component parts of finished parent products. Demand is a function of a parent product. Are you building carburetors? Or does anyone use carburetors in the conventional sense anymore? But if you're old like me, I remember when they actually had carburetors in new cars. You had the carburetor, which number of carburetors you need to produce was dependent on the number of vehicles being produced by Ford, by Chevy, by whoever. That was a dependent demand. It means someone else's use of something determined how much of your stuff was needed. And that's the dependent demand. So I think of another types of inventories. How long is this one? 3 minutes. Oh, gotta stay with me on this one.
Inventory management deals essentially with balancing the inventory levels. Inventory is categorized into two types based on the demand pattern, which creates the need for inventory. The two types of demand are independent demand and dependent demand for inventories. Independent demand: an inventory of an item is said to be falling into the category of independent demand when the demand for such an item is not dependent upon the demand for another item. Finished goods items, which are ordered by external customers or manufactured for stock and sale, are called independent demand items. Independent demands for inventories are based on confirmed customer orders, forecasts, estimates and past historical data. Dependent demand: if the demand for inventory of an item is dependent upon another item, such demands are categorized as dependent demand. Raw materials and component inventories are dependent upon the demand for finished goods and hence can be called as dependent demand inventories. Take the example of a car. The car as finished goods is produced and held in inventory as independent demand item, while the raw materials and components used in the manufacture of the finished goods car derives its demand from the demand for the car and hence is characterized as dependent demand inventory. This differentiation between demands is necessary, because the inventory management systems and process are different for both categories. While finished goods inventories, which is characterized by independent demand, are managed with sales order process and supply chain management processes and are based on sales forecasts, the dependent demand for raw materials and components to manufacture the finished goods is managed through material resources planning, in short MRP, or enterprise resource planning, in short ERP, using models such as just-in-time, Kanban and other concepts. MRP, as well as ERP planning, depends upon the sales forecast released for finished goods as the starting point for further action. Managing raw material inventories is far more complicated than managing finished goods inventory. This involves analyzing and co-coordinating delivery capacity, lead times and delivery schedules of all raw material suppliers, coupled with the logistical processes and transit timelines involved in transportation and warehousing of raw materials before they are ready to be supplied to the production shop floor. Raw material management also involves periodic review of the inventory holding, inventory counting and audits, followed by detailed analysis of the reports leading to financial and management decisions. Inventory planners who are responsible for planning, managing and controlling raw material inventories have to answer two fundamental questions, which can also be termed as two basic inventory decisions. Number 1, inventory planners need to decide how much of quantity of each item is to be ordered from raw material suppliers or from other production departments within the organization. And number 2, when should the orders be placed? Answering these two questions will call for a lot of back-end work and analysis involving inventory classifications and economic order quantity determination coupled with cost analysis. These decisions are always taken in coordination with procurement, logistics and finance departments.
Okay, having heard all that, you've heard at the very end a few things like economic order quantities, and also talking with, and we've heard those through this whole chapter about cross-functional analysis. That you may want to say, as an inventory, want to order so much inventory. The finance department may say, no, we ain't got that much money. So this is where all this is never operated in a silo. The other thing I'm going to point out is, in the classroom, it's easy to say, yes, here's dependent demand, here's independent demand. There's certain things have a gray area. I would use, like an example we use in the car, is a tire something that's forecast as dependent or independent demand? Well, if you're going to be selling tires to Ford to make their cars, okay, well, I can say it's very dependent because the more cars that Ford makes, the more tires they want from you That's a dependent demand. On the other hand, if you're a Les Schwab that doesn't sell it, they're sending to customers who have different cyclical and financial operations on when they buy their cars. During economic downturns, Les Schwab sells fewer tires because people have less money when you're going through a recession. On the other hand, people have actually been buying a lot of tires from Les Schwab, have been fixing up their cars during this COVID time. So don't focus, again, and that's why I said at the very beginning, on an absolute identification of this type of product is this type of demand. The context of what your product is and how you're getting it to the customer is the important thing on determining this and how you order things. Tires in one context can be an independent demand, and in another context can be a dependent demand, depending on who your end customers are. And if you're someone who sells tires to both Ford and Les Schwab, you're going to have to do some mixed modeling to figure out how much you should be procuring in silver rubber and other polymers you do that. So it's not so easy. That's why you will find that certain tire manufacturers actually have a business to business, as they call it, B2B, and business to customer departments. Meaning if you're making tires, those that go to Les Schwab may have different inventory and modeling than those that go to Ford or GM. So it's not the product itself by itself, but the context of that product and how it gets from you to the customer that is important on figuring out what inventories you need. Make sense to anybody? Okay, because I don't want people so often get that and just say, oh, tires, that's what they are. No, it's what you're doing. Oops, oh, come on, next page. All right. Here's the crux of this chapter, the economic order quantity. EOQ. Boy, that sounds intimidating. Anyone feel intimidated? Oh, okay, only 3 of you. All right, fine. Then I'll just skip it and talk to the other 3. No, but it's the whole objective here, and this goes back to that video with Lady says, how much do you keep of inventory at any given time to make sure you're minimizing the cost of storing that, but also maximizing what the customer needs and getting it out the door. Finding that optimal level in that water tank analogy of how high the water should be at any given time to make sure the demand side doesn't go dry, but that we don't overflow by having too much supply and the inventory spills over the top. And that's what we're trying to find out with this economic order quantity is what's the optimal level, if you will. It's used a lot still. It's an old concept, 100 years old now. Some people say on some of these things, like students say, well, duh. It seems pretty simple. It really was only about 100, 150 years ago that the world sat down and started saying, gosh, that guy's making money. That guy's losing money. Why? And we started documenting it with what we now call modern business science, called an operations management is a huge part of that. So even though some of these things say, well, duh, it wasn't that long ago that people just sort of didn't understand. We now talk about, I keep talking about the Ford and the production line, and it makes sense today, but until we started documenting what he was doing, it was like, whoa, we don't know how this guy is making cloth faster than everyone else. So, some assumptions. And these assumptions are important for this because we're going to break these assumptions later. And still show you it can still work though. Demand rate is constant. This is a little different than that beer model we had in the aggregate planning model where they had seasonality. We're assuming the demand is constant. Why? For demonstration purposes, it's simpler. Lead time is constant, meaning when you order stuff, you know how long it's going to take to get to you. When you order whatever raw material you have, you know how reasonable time it's going to get to you in the same amount of time every time. Stockouts are not allowed, meaning you're not going to run out of stuff ever. You're not going to have disappointed customers who say, I want to get my 2x6s, and they're not here. They're produced in a batch lot or all at once. So you're going to have a consistent amount of something you're going to produce for a particular period of time that you're going to produce it. You're not going repeatedly and one day building this, one day building that. You're building something that, at least for a consistent period of time, that's worth noting. You're building the same thing for a period of time, the same batch contacts we've talked about throughout this course. So, and here are the tricky parts. In the real life, these ones get complicated. Unit cost mean the cost for each is the same. Now, as we saw in that video on inventories, you get, and anyone who's ever shopped at Costco knows you get a quantity discount. But for purposes of our model, we're saying no quantity discounts. We're trying to keep life simple for now. Carrying cost is the same per unit, which means if you buy a new warehouse, the cost of that warehouse to store more stuff is the same cost of the old warehouse to store stuff. And setup cost per order is consistent, meaning every time you set it up, it's going to be, and start rebuilding that cost, whatever setup time it takes to start moving that lathe and getting the millwork done. It's the same every time you start it up. And then we have this wonderful stock keeping unit. And I have a video on these SKUs, which are actually international. It's one of the good things that actually happens through the UN, that we have actually barcodes for stock keeping units that you can make the same scan in Saudi Arabia that you make in downtown Burbank for a particular type of product and unit. And that's why we can sell things comfortably between China, Brazil, United Kingdom, because certain types of finished products have been classified. It started in the US and it's international. But if you work in healthcare, it's a bit like having CPT codes and IC9 codes. If you don't know what those are, don't worry. But where we have stock keeping units that are now going international because everyone wants to buy from the US and you want to track what you're doing, better you use the US's codes. And that's why you see people everywhere from Home Depot to other stuff things with their little scheme, Costco, their little scanners, or in the supermarket, scanning beep, that little UPC code that you see that they scan to check out your merchandise at Fred Meyer is a form of stock keeping unit. And that's why they get so upset when you have to do a manual type in something because we don't know how accurate it is.
It's always so embarrassing if you're in a store and you're using the Amazon app to scan the SKU to see if it's cheaper online. I always feel super guilty.
Well, you know what, I'll tell you, this is an embarrassing story, but it's one of those things where years ago, I went to a buddy of mine when during a power outage, I had his family over here, and we bought a bunch of vegetables to make some stir fry. And not thinking, we threw some rutabagas in here and things in this bag. And he came up there with a big bag of vegetables mixed together. And so the gal looked at us and yeah, we looked like two stupid 20-year-olds and said, oh, okay. So he said, oh, that's probably about 90 cents a pound. Okay. But because we didn't have it separated into an SKU unit, we completely destroyed their inventory calculations for that night.
That was another thing we dealt with at Home Depot. You could buy like individual pieces of like decorative tile. And a lot of the times those are produced in massive batches where they're coming in cardboard boxes, about 30 of them. And we kept having trouble with our supplier to where it was never going to have a SKU in it, but that identification number was never transmitted to it. So we used to deal with this all the time. The same thing with taking home samples of hardwood. People would take home a bunch of them and they'd want to return it to get their deposit back and so forth. And there was just no accounting. The person that rung it up just wrote it up as 20 of this SKU, and just a nightmare for us logistically.
Well, I'll give you another example at Fred Meyer the other day. I bought some Vitamin Zero water, and I bought orange because my boy likes orange, and I bought, what is this? Acacia berry. Oh, my heart must be getting better by the talk about Acacia blueberry and pomegranate. I'm going to live forever. But bought about 20 bottles to get us through next week or so. So 20 bottles, scan the first one, which was red. Didn't scan the fact that she probably took out 6 orange as well. Now the inventory, if you worry about whether they're going to have too much orange or too little one of Fred Meyer, it's because they showed like 20 reds going off the shelf when it was actually 16 red, and 4 orange. Now translate that to if you're using 2x4s at Home Depot or tires somewhere, whatever it is. These little stock units are wonderful things, but they're not perfect because you always have that thing which we've talked about so often is human error. What I've talked about before about weighted averages, and it's only as good as the person says, well, 50% for last year is pretty good, and 20% for the year before that. Your weighted average is only because of that human error. And human error comes in these stock keeping units. And that's why Amazon loves to have robots going down, because robots make less decisions about, oh, let's just wrap these all up into one big thing. Okay. Oops. Now then, this is a diagram which I look in the book and I say, no, I'm not been a big fan of the pictures on this. What this is trying to do, and I'm not going to go through every one of these in the book, but basically trying to say, okay, you buy a bunch of stuff, lot size Q, and then over time, you use it up. And that's why this line starts going down from top left to bottom right until it gets almost to zero. Some might argue zero, then you order a new lot up there. And then you start using up until you order new stuff. Cool. So your average inventory is your quantity. Basically, average inventory is when you ordered it divided by 2. That's your average inventory, which is about half your ordering quantity. And as we go through the different types of ordering quantities, we're going to have similar diagrams to this in the book, but they get stretched out or pushed together in the ordering times. In this case, for our example, we're talking about even ordering times. Usage is always consistent, meaning demand is always consistent, so we don't have to have unevenly spaced ordering times. But the next two, when we get into P's and the Q methodologies, we will deal with those. So we're going to start getting to numbers. And this is straight out of the book. And we have numbers and letters here that represent numbers. And when I talk about jumping ahead to what's going to be on the final on that, if you're given these types of things, some of these numbers, your job is going to be knowing that I've given these numbers, what calculation can I do? Demand rate, units per year. Now, generally we're doing units per year, but we can do units for other things as long as they're consistent. And this is just like before in the previous chapter, where I said what messes people up on their throughput times is they don't get everything converted to the same units of travel, what widgets per hour or widgets per day, widgets for whatever it is. If you're given something and we use so many of these per day, but the stock goes out, it gets deplenished at so many per year, whatever it is. Get your units consistent so they work well together. People mess up on these type of calculations because they don't have their units in similar declinations, and it just becomes a garbage in, garbage out, even if you pick the right formula. So think about what level of information, because in the real world, different warehouses, different salespeople keep their measure how much they sell in different units than the warehouses in what they keep, and the manufacturing operations in how much they make. If everyone could calculate everything in the exact same units, life would be so wonderful, but they don't. So keep that in mind, because that's what will screw you up if you're given one thing in units per year, per day, per hour, whatever it is. Costs per order placed and setup dollars per order, meaning what it takes. You're transferring from one set of manufacturing batch jobs to a new batch job. It costs you money to have people reset the lathe, clean it, readjust it, recalibrate it, whatever. Unit cost, what's it actually cost you to do it? You've set up the cost, but once you've done that, it costs you amount per manufacturing. And our carrying rate, we know about that. It costs us so much to hold it per year. And lot size, how many of these things you're making of whatever it is. And the total cost, the ordering cost plus the carrying cost in dollars. The total cost, and people can see that TC and get thrown away because you had so many definitions so far, but okay, ordering cost plus carrying cost, that's what it's going to cost you, the total cost. What it costs to make it, what's the cost to hold on to it before you sell it? So but this is in the book, can't remember the page it's on, but as you go back and forth and throw numbers in these things, here are the definitions. Now then, equations coming at us now. Hold on to your hats. This is where it gets fun. Ordering costs. Cost per order times number of orders per year. Oh my goodness. SD. Cost per order plus the amount of demand. times the number per year. So when you start thinking about how these things work, this SD divided by Q, costs per order, the demand per year, divided by the orders per year. That's your ordering cost, the cost to order something. So as you start seeing these definitions, just go back to those letters and it sort of flows. Carrying costs. On average, how much you carrying? You got that magic I. Again, don't let these letters fool you. They're just straight out of that list. Okay, time the cost per unit. How much you carrying? What does each one cost you? Plus your average inventory that you're carrying. Well, you already know that Q over 2, average inventory level, is from here because we're ordering, every time we order the same amount. So over any 2 time periods, it's the amount you ordered divided by 2. That's your average inventory by definition. Does that mean you always have that much in the warehouse? No, but on average, which is that magic statistic we should learn to hate because it covers a multitude of sins, but it's the one thing people can understand, so they use it. So really, if I wanted to put this better, I probably would put I times C times Q over 2, average inventory. When you see it as ICQ, as the book shows it, you see ICQ over 2, but it's really I, the carrying rate, times unit costs, times average inventory. That Q over 2 is average inventory level. Whatever you give it. Annual costs, ordering costs per year, and plus the carrying costs per year. All this is adding up the carrying costs and the ordering costs. What did it take you to get it? And what's it costing you to hold on to it? That's the total cost. Is anyone's brain exploding before I move forward? I'm not seeing any emojis, so I'm going to move forward. But when you see these in chapters, just keep going back to this and say, okay, it kind of makes sense. How much am I ordering versus that? Oh, now here's a fun, this is the economist diagram. And either for good or bad, I used to teach economics. So I look at this and say, oh, it's wonderful. Students who aren't used to this look at this and say, who threw up on the page? But all we're trying to say is okay, we're trying to minimize our costs overall. And we know we've got costs of manufacturing stuff, and we've got costs of holding on to it after we've manufactured it. So how can we keep that water level in that bucket at the right level so we're getting the optimal, and an optimal means least expensive way of holding on to stuff versus making stuff? And where's that, how much should we make, given that we have this demand that's coming out the bottom of the spigot? So what's the optimal level? So we're going to know that total cost is this nice curve here, and it has diminishing returns as you already dealt with before. Now carrying cost is easy because we know it's based on inventory, and we can come up with average inventory levels. That carrying costs plus cost of inventory times that Q over 2, which is average inventory cost. Since everything's constant demand and constant costs, nothing's going up and down independently of each other, it's fairly easy to say. Now ordering cost, which is your demand, you got divided by the ordering cost, go back up here. Ordering costs, cost per order by orders per year. Cool. So we're trying to come up with a point where those two combined are the least. And when you see this diagram, we're basically trying to say, where is that number? And that's what this nice little complication would come up called the EOQ, economic order quantity equation, which combines these things. That's what we're seeking. When these two things are minimal together, economically, hence economic order quantity, economically, it makes sense to do it at that point. And that's where we're trying to go and find where are these two things where what it costs us to get it plus what it costs us to hold it, when is that the least? And that's what these nice little diagrams are trying to say. versus cost versus how many we order. And that's the whole objective. This is what everyone should be saying, whew, philosophically. But that's the objective. We know how much it costs us to make it. We know how much it costs us to store it. With those two things in mind, varying together, how much does it cost us when it's the least? So, oh, interesting though, but, and these are some of those things, some people may say this is, well, duh. I don't think it is, but when you just look at why is carrying cost higher over here in this corner than it is over here in this corner?
With time, it's always going to cost money.
Not time, but remember what's going across here. Number of stuff. The more stuff you have, the more expensive it is to hold on to it. That's why this line goes from down here to up here. Okay, ordering costs. Well, the initial cost of ordering has a lot of setup, but the more you make, the less it costs per unit. You know, you have that setup cost, which might be, each unit might cost you $1 make, but you might have a setup cost of $1,000. So the first one you make might essentially cost you $1,001. But the more units you make, on average, your cost per unit goes down because those setup costs get spread over the whole cost of each one. So the more you sell, the more that setup cost gets spread out over more things, so it's less. And that's why ordering cost basically decreases over time. And when those two intersect is that magic number we're looking for. Hope that didn't confuse you even more. So,
Those of us who play video games understand.
there's actually posted a lot of videos out there, which I'm not having you watch each one, but it goes through these stuff. I actually find out there's not a lot of really good inventory management videos out there, which means I should probably make some and start that myself. So then, what we're trying to do here essentially is say, by what this diagram says, we're looking for where these two things intersect. We're looking where the carrying costs, IC times Q over 2, and the ordering costs, SD divided by Q, equal each other. So we come up with this marvelous equation where all we do is take those two things and set one equal to the other. And all we do is, I'm not making you do it, but we solve for Q. We have a Q on this side, S times D over Q, and IC, and I put parentheses around it here because I like that better, times that, times the cost, times the average inventory, and we mathematically solve to find the Q that is that place where they both equal each other. And that's what this whole diatribe in the text does. It just come up with these, we want these two things equal to each other, and we want the quantity when they're equal to each other, so we know we order that much each time. And that's all we're doing is solving for Q. If you want to sit down with a piece of paper and play algebra, you can do this. I thought about putting on here a couple of classes ago, but I thought, let's let you trust me. One day I should offer this for extra credit, have you derive this from scratch. But all we're doing is taking these two equations, ordering costs and holding costs, because we want to know when they're equal, but that's the minimum cost overall. And that's where this economic ordering quantity comes from, when this quantity, that Q and that Q are equal. This is where we have a dramatic pause. Does that make sense to anybody? No emojis from nobody playing along at home? Whoa, this is tricky. All right, I've got one emoji. Thanks, Ken, for playing. Everyone else, I assume, has gone out. Oh, thank you. Everyone else has gone out for lunch. Okay, but that's the whole thing. And this is one of those things where I say, okay, if you want to derive from scratch, please do. But you can take this and it becomes a plug and chug formula like some of the other stuff we've done. The rationale is just we took the math, did the algebra, and solved for Q on these two equations. That's where it comes from. And that's why we have a square root of this, because when you solve this for Q, you end up with Q squared. So you Q on the bottom, Q on the bottom. you end up with Q squared at one point, and that's why it's a square root. Square roots throw people. Let's go forward. Oh, more special effects. Let's do that again. All right. Now then, here's an example of how it works. Your demand is 10 cases a week. The cost per order, setup cost is $12 per order. Remember, we're dealing with batch processes, so you can deal with a big batch of processes to be done on this order. Might be for 100, might be 10, whatever it is you're making. So we have cost per order placed and setup costs are $12 per order. That's the S. Go back to those things. But I've got definitions down here again for you, the definitions. Unit cost, which each individual unit, whatever unit you're selling in this case it's a case, $8 per case. And if you don't sell it and just hold on to it, it costs you 30% that cost per year. Okay, now then, first thing you have to do is make sure the demand rate is consistent. You want to get it into a year. Why? Because you got 30% per year. You want everything consistent. So if you got 10 cases per week and you're selling it for a year, 10 times 52 is, ta-da, 520. If you would get this wrong, we'll just take 10 cases and plug and chug. So, next slide. We take these things and we just put all these numbers down below because we have this nice new formula we just derived from making those two things equal. 2 times S times D times I times C. 2, that 2 is that 2. S, that S is that S, 12, 12. We just calculated the annual cases per year divided by 0.3, also known as 30%. And the unit cost, $80. That C is that C, which is that, times $80. You type that in, excuse me, and you get 22.8 cases a year. So that what that tells you, if you remember back to that nice little graph with the up, down, up, down, up, down. Actually, it's backwards to you. So you go up, down, up, down, up, down. Every time you order 22.8 cases. Basically, every time a year, or 4 times a year in that case, if it's 4 times. And that's basically it. It can vary plug and chug, but it kind of makes sense. The biggest leap is going from that solving for Q, which is what this is. But after that, it's a plug and chug. What you have to do is make sure your units are aligned. You've got, and just plug in which pieces you got and do the math. Another dramatic pause. Waiting for someone to beg for mercy for me to go over this again, or say you at least got a sense where we're going, and I'll go forward. I feel your pain, Ken. Again, philosophically is the important thing here, because we're trying to figure out that optimal level. Because if you buy too much, you run out of money. If you buy too little, you don't have enough to satisfy your customer. And by definition, we're not going to ever let you run out in this model. But EOQ is a plug and chug method. All right, I'm waiting for objections before I go to the next slide and people cry. Hearing none. Again, just go back to these things. This is a big step, but if you don't believe me, work it out on yourself. Now then, your total costs, the exact same order. Ordering costs plus holding costs. So you say, what's going to cost you to do all this per year? Well, you got the ordering costs, same thing you used before. Your S, your $12 an order, times the amount. And you got that quantity that we just calculated, that 22.8, your average quantity. That 22.8 right here is that 22.8 do all the math on that one. That I is that I, the same numbers you've been using before, Q over 2. So the cost of ordering it and the cost of holding on to it. This is the number you give to finance and say, here is where you're going to have to make sure we have enough money to pay this throughout the year. That's why finance cares. The fact that these are so close, 273.68, 273.60 is a coincidence. Don't assume they're always going to be the same. But if you're asked for what is the total cost, and you're given this, all this information, you basically have a two-step process. First, you calculate the order quantity. Then you plug it in these formulas, ordering costs and holding costs, with the other figures you've already got. So be prepared for that, because if somebody asks you, what's the total cost of this widget manufacturing process batch job? Your first step is do the EOC. Even if I haven't asked you for the EOC, you need that in order to calculate this, because it has a Q in here. And the EOQ, economic order quantity, is what we're looking for. And that's why you know whether or not you're going to go broke before you sell your stuff. Alrighty, now then, these next two, I'm not going to go into detailed examples with it, but I'm going to talk about them philosophically. And just like that, chapter 11, there are two really well, if you want to go to actual numbers on it, on the end, at page 310 to 311, on the Q and P, there are some really nicely worked out problems you might want to review before the final to go through really clearly. And when I go through these things with you, again, as I said at the very beginning of this class, I'm not going to ask you to like come up with standard deviations from scratch and all that stuff. But if you're given the right pieces, you need to figure out where to plug them in for the context of what the question says. It's an open book. If you don't remember that square root of, even I have to look it up, square root of 2SD over IC by heart, it's in the book. But remember the context and why you need it and when you need it, given the information you've got. Now then, the downside, as the book says, of that EOC model is that it assumes all sorts of constants. Constant demand, constant cost, constant everything. And it's done that to set up with you so you can say, okay, here's a simplified way to look at the world. That's what economists do. Then we start introducing variances that make you have to start sweating at night. So we have this two things, the Q and the P systems. Quantity is the Q. Basically says, when it says relations is the assumption of constant demand, it means some month, it goes back to that aggregate model on beer. Some months you might have this much demand, some months you might have this much demand. It allows you to try to figure out on average, essentially, what you should be ordering, given that the demand is going to change throughout the year. So what's a rough number to do so you don't have too much in the warehouse at any time, because if you have too much, it might spoil or it costs a lot of money. So you check on an ongoing basis how much you have, and if you go below a certain reorder point, you order. Now this is, if you really want to get down to where we're going to on this, we're essentially going back to those really cool control charts that you guys love so much in the first half of this class. And we're essentially putting one of those in place on top of these to say, okay, we have an average demand and we're putting in some parameters just like those control limits, except generally it's only one, meaning if your inventory falls below a level, then when it gets down to outside that lower control limit, we order. Doesn't matter if it happens in the first month, 8th month, or 10th month, when it hits below that level, one of those control limits that we establish, that's when we order. And we know how much to order because of this computation. That's where we're trying to go with all of this. So we're still using the order size that we already calculated. What we're changing is when we order. In the pure model of EOQ, we ordered every quarter, every time, same time throughout the year. This we're changing when we're going to order, if you will. Fixed order quantity system, we're changing where we do it. So here's what we do. The amount to order each time is still that EOQ, one we just finished calculating. But we order in when inventory gets below a certain point, a certain limit, if you will, like a control limit, like those control charts. And what we're trying to find is this reorder point, R. So we have this average demand time, doing a certain lead time, and a safety stock. And remember that safety stock we talked about at the very beginning of chapter, or this, or tonight, the beginning of chapter. And this is where that magical number that we're saying, okay, we want to make sure we don't ever run out and make the customer very angry with us. So we're always going to have a buffer, if you will. Instead of beginning, it doesn't always work. The safety stock in personal protective equipment for a lot of people got blown out of water this past year. But it's sort of management sits around. The safety stock is that, there's all sorts of ways you can come up with safety stock, but it is that Achilles heel, like the alpha, the percentages unweighted, is that your reorder point is only as good as your estimation of how much you really need to keep as a buffer, if you will, on orders. If you keep too much, well, you're wasting money storing more than you need to. If you keep too little, you may have upset customers and run out of 2x6s. So that's what it's trying to do. Average demand during the lead time and the safety stock. So that's basically when you get your average demand, and it says that lead time means you have to be able to order it, and that's the lead time. That's why it has that average demand during the lead time. At that point, it has to be within that lead time, meaning how fast you get new stuff coming in the door when you order it. And that's what that average demand for lead time is. Okay, if I order it now, will it come in the door before I run out? That's basically all this is saying, this M. Safety stock is a buffer on top of that. So if your average lead time is 5 weeks, but you've got on average 1 week of stuff left, you're in trouble. So you continually make these calculations daily, weekly, whatever your batch job requires, to say, okay, if I'm going to run out in a week, can you get more stuff in the door in less than a week? And that's why we look at the lead time. Because even if you come up with this reorder point, if it takes you longer to get stuff and you run out before it comes in the door, you're in trouble. That's the continuous review system. You're doing it every day, and there's some of those software systems we talked about will calculate this for you all the time. And that's why things like the SQU and that are so important, because they track how much you've got, whatever you got, and they will do this for you and flag you if something's getting too low. If you want to tell it, we're going to use a continuous review time to calculate our inventories. And you'll get warnings. Fast food restaurants work on this all the time. That's why it's so rare. The only time I ever actually had Dairy Queen run out of chicken strip baskets during this COVID, because they didn't anticipate how many people were running through that. But and this actually helps you in that term we heard, just-in-time inventory, which means not to carry as minimal inventory as possible. So you order it just in time so that the last one that you're running out goes out the door as the first new batch comes in. That's just in time. So you're really not holding anything much. And your safety stock is almost, just-in-time inventory, your safety stock is almost nothing, because you're assuming that the new item you need to make stuff comes in just as you're using the last one. So then, when demand is random, and this is where we get into the service level. Before we had the constant demand, we're assuming demand comes in any form. So, safety stock, S. Safety stock, S. How do you get the safety stock? We're talking about here the S in this R plus M, R equals M plus S, safety stock. And because anytime there's a potential for human error, we try to quantify as much as possible. And this is where standard deviation comes in. Those of you who thought you'd never see it again after control charts, cool, we're back. And that's why I say right now, see, we're doing what a control chart is. We're coming up with a level that is supposed to be within the parameters to meeting our needs. So safety stock is a safety factor, oh my goodness, who comes up with that? Times the standard deviation in demand during the lead time, meaning during that time it's going to take you to get the next batch of orders, how much, on average, how much variation are you going to have before the order comes in the door? Because if you suddenly have a very big standard deviation, you might run out of stuff before this product comes in the door. So that's why your safe level of ordering is that safe factor that you're going to put in place times the volatility of that factor. The whole objective is you don't run out of things before the new ones come in the door. So how they define it: probability that all customers' orders will be filled while waiting for the supply order to arrive. Whew. Basically means that you put an order in and you know it's not coming in 3 weeks. How fast are we going to use up the inventory on average before that 3 weeks is up? Are we going to run out before that newest, whatever we need, 2x4 comes in the door? So, and the amount of demand that's going to come from just holding things on hand. It's just sort of, we're trying to minimize the risk that we're going to run out of stuff before the new stuff comes in the door, knowing that we're not going to have one widget per day. Might have one widget sold on one day, 10 widgets the next, 2 the next. And that's volatility is why we have a standard deviation, just like the volatility we had in performance on those control charts to come up with on average, we're safe if we stay within this parameter. And this is the parameter we're trying to come up with for safety. It's common, well, a purist would say, no, that's not what it is, but try to think of it in terms of this is a control limit that we're setting in the formula to say, hey, don't fall below this, or you miss filling orders. A lot of words for something that ends up being a plug and chug for most of you on the final. But philosophically, you need to understand what's going on, because one day you might even, if you're not going to do this from scratch, you'll have a piece of software that says, do you want to do this and why? And understand the why. 427, we'll never get to everything. Now then, periodic review system. Periodically, P for periodically, we look at where we are. This is trying to do the same thing, but, oh, I forgot to take out the special effects. We look at the inventory every now and then on a fixed system. Once a week, once a month, whatever you decide to set up. Bread delivery trucks go to the same delivery every week. Inventory brought up to a target level. Bottom line is you have a target level, you want to maintain your inventory. So we're going to say how much you order at that point. And here's where we difference. We're varying quantity, it's set because we're looking at the same time interval. Before, we said we're looking at different time intervals all the time. We might order multiple times a month or not for 6 months, as long as we can keep within that parameter. And that was the cue. Here we're saying we're going to always look at everything at a fixed point in time, once a day, once a week, once a quarter, whatever it is. And then we might change how much we order this time based on where we are in the world. Fixed order interval system, P system, meaning we always have certain places we will be able to order. Oh my goodness. P is the time between orders. Well, we know what we're going to order because we have a certain level that management says, here's what we're ordering. So the quantity over the demand. Cool, and that gives us our period that we're going to have to order on. How much you need versus how much is going out the door. So if you're having 400 things for the whole year and you need to order once a month, you look at it, you're going to have at least 400 divided by 100 to make your 400 per year. So that's how you come up with it. So this is the same type of thing we've done before. And we go back to those same equations we had before, except we're solving for time this time. The period between orders. And again, this is one of the things where I'm not going to make you derive this from scratch, but you're dealing with the same parameters you've been dealing with before. And it said, hey, we're going to try and find out the right ordering interval this time, instead of saying, do we want the right order, the right quantity, or do you just want to figure out in the basic EOC how much we're going to order every time at the same time? And that's where we sort of started off. We start off with the basic economic order quantity, ordering the same amount, the same time throughout the year, to, okay, we're going to order the same quantity but different times whenever we get low. As soon as we get below a certain point, we'll order then. Now we're trying to say, okay, if we're going to order something, how long should we order between, how much time between individual orders to get there? So we have to have a target inventory level, which is our average demand over the period, safety stock, similar terms, the same vulnerabilities as before. So if you're given a target inventory level and your average demand over this time period with the lead time, P plus L, lead time. Remember, you gotta, as soon as you order something, it doesn't come in the door that day. That's why you have to always take the lead time. You may order on Tuesday, but it might take you to Friday to get it. Or it might take you to Friday of next month to get it, whatever it is. That's why the lead time is important, because as soon as you order it, it doesn't appear magically beamed into your warehouse by Scotty. It takes time to get it. And that's why we always incorporate the lead time, the average demand that's going to take over that lead time is important. Now then, why do we care about these two types of things? It depends what you do. If you go to the grocery store on the same day every week, what do we need to get us to the next week? You carry more inventory, but you're less likely to run out. Or to say, more likely to run out because you have volatility that can come in. Think about toilet paper. The Q system, you go whenever you need something. And that's the basic thing. The Q system and P system, when you run out, you order it. On the other hand, with a P system, you're trying to say, I'm going to go once a week. So I'm going to do my best to estimate what I need to get me through to the next week. And that's the philosophical difference between these two things. Achilles' heel is, may we require more unplanned trips to the store. I have to do this week. Didn't get tea last week. Wasn't out of tea last week. But now my wife's drinking my tea, so I need more. That's the thing on the Q system. I was trying to do this on the P system, but I ran out. So I'm going to have to go to the store once more because the demand in my house changed on T. So I'm going to run out. So now I'm going to have to go outside the periodic system I have, essentially do a mini Q system, because my wife's drinking 2 of my cups of tea a day, and I have budget for 28 per week, and my quantity demand has changed. So my P system of once a week going to Safeway has failed.
You need your safety stock.
I thought I had enough, but at 2 more bags per week, they only sell them in 40 boxes of 40. You can do the math. It annoys my wife when I did the math and say, look, I actually did the math. My wife said, look, I have 28 budgeted. There's 40 per box. That means 2 times 28. I know when I got to buy it, more than that. And what did she owe me? She should have stuck coffee. Now then, the last thing I'm going to talk about in this, and I know those Q and things, and I chose not to go through detailed examples because I know you can plug and chug. And if I went through those detailed examples, we'd be here till like 7 tonight. But read those 2 examples in the book. You will have a question on P and Q, just like you have an EOQ. But the examples in the book are really good. I know I criticized the book somehow, but they go through really Any problem I might ask you on the final is in those two examples on 230, 310 and 311. There's no tricking. It's just giving you the right numbers and having you make sure they convert to consistent units and recognize what I'm asking you. And I'm not going to do anything tricky. I might say, assuming you're using a P-style inventory system, how would you calculate this? Assuming you're using a Q-style, how would you calculate this? That should send you immediate to place and figure out philosophically where you are. Or if I asked you something like, a disadvantage of the P system is, and you have 1 out of 4 to choose, including none of the above. So that's what I'm going through. I'm not going to hit you on any calculation you can't do without being able to identify the pieces. Now, in ABC inventory management, I'm going to talk a little bit about this. I've actually put a video on this as well, because coming up, those of you who looked ahead to week 10, you actually have this for your discussion question. So you get time to think about it. I thought it was appropriate just after Thanksgiving if you'll all be staring at your refrigerators. So you can be asked to do a refrigerator assessment using the ABC method for week 10. So that Pareto chart, remember that nice little one that had bars that went in diminishing amounts and saying where your stuff's going in percentage wise? Everyone knows the 80-20 rule. Usually it's where you spend 80% of your time worrying about 20% of the stuff. And that's very true. So it's basically that. You're going to classify things into ranges in that Pareto, 80-20. How are you going to classify it in terms of, what are you using versus what it costs you? And that's where we're coming up through. And to try to manage, and you get these SKUs, I'm not saying you should classify your refrigerator in terms of SKUs for that assignment, but just do in general what you're doing. Is to offset priorities to manage different units to where you want to put your resources. So here's examples they use on A items typically, and these percentages are just roughly, they're management decisions. You can say, okay, of 20% of inventory items constitute 80% of your dollars that you spend. And going down the line to classify to A, B, and C into lower and lower levels, basically to say, where's your bang for buck and what are you worrying about, if you will. And so everything's approximate. And so when you go through this, the whole idea is to do this type of analysis inventory to say, where are we spending our dollars on what can impact us and where should we basically change our priorities? What are you storing a lot of that may not be giving you value added in the processes you're going through? And that's the whole point of this ABC. It's a very tried and true. I see this actually used a lot. And you can actually get it inventory management systems that will classify this for you. But I view this more as not so much an inventory management system as more of a management priority system. Do you have your mind right about what you should be thinking of and where you should spend your time worrying about? Are you worrying about managing that small amount of inventory? And the example of this I might use is that, if you remember back on control charts, I used an example where I had one of the managers, the director who, he and I ended up not being very close friends, where I was going after one because he was convinced that all the world's financial problems at Mentor Graphics would be solved if we honed in on travel expenses. And basically through part of my analysis, it involved controller, it was saying, look, you're spending a huge amount. He was spending a huge amount of his time on this control unit, which was minor in the great scheme of things, but had a great impact. Remember that example I said, this guy who just personally saved the company on one quarter. Okay, he blew his travel dollars out, but was it a problem? No. He celebrated, and as I said before, was the controller or the CFO said we should have sent him a private jet instead of criticizing him for upgrading to business class. So it's trying to look at those types of things, and it's a great way of starting for your inventory analysis. Okay, breakout rooms. Who needs 5 minutes or so? 10 minutes. We'll see how fast we get to breakout rooms. All right, I got 4:39. Should we meet back here at 10 till? Okay, I'll pause recording, turn off my video, and we'll go from there. See you about until we'll get through this as fast as we can.